Hello, and welcome to another lecture from Ethical Issues and Journalism. My name is Professor Harper, and I don't want to engage in a conversation or analysis of fake news today, but I would like to take a walk down memory lane, if you will, to look at the ethical problems that have been created by a lot of journalists just making stuff up, and it's caused problems for journalists today because of the credibility problem, which has been a growing problem for journalism among the public. So let's go through a history of some of the problems that have been created by fictitious stories. One that you probably haven't heard of, but has been prominent for a number of years, is the story of Walter Duranty, who was the Moscow bureau chief of the New York Times immediately after the Russian Revolution. In 1932, Duranty won a Pulitzer Prize for a series of reports about the Soviet Union, and he was criticized that he totally ignored that there was a huge famine that was going on, particularly in Ukraine. As it turned out, Duranty actually was closely tied to the communist government of Russia. Um, and it took a number of years later that the New York Times finally um, recognized that this series that won the Pulitzer Prize should not have. In fact, the Times didn't give back the prize, but said that denying that the famine existed constituted some of the worst reporting to appear in this newspaper. There's a pretty famous one from Philadelphia involving a prominent journalist by the name of Harry Carafin, who was an investigative reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer in the 50s and 60s. And he was known for getting a number of stories about corruption into the paper and actually was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize at one point. But he was dismissed from the Inquirer in 1967 because he accepted payments from individuals not to run stories about them in the newspaper. Ultimately, he was charged and convicted of 40 counts of blackmail and also corrupt solicitation of bribes. And he was sentenced to 4 to 9 years and ultimately another 2 to 7 year sentence. And he died in prison in 1973. Janet Cook was a very famous case of the Washington Post in 1980. Um, she was a young reporter who wrote a story called Little Jimmy's World, and it was allegedly about the life of an 8-year-old heroin addict in the District of Columbia. She described, quote, the needle marks freckling the baby's smooth skin of his thin brown arms. It turned out that she made up the story. It was a composite um, of information that she had. Jimmy didn't exist. Um, Bob Woodward, who had just gained notoriety for his work in Watergate, was her editor, and he nominated the story for the Pulitzer Prize. The story won the Pulitzer Prize, and ultimately, Janet Cook and the Washington Post had to fess up that the story was in fact made up and fictitious. Mike Barnicle is still a fixture in journalism and spends a lot of time with MSNBC. He, in 1998, which seems to be a year where there was a lot of fiction and plagiarism and other bad stuff going on in journalism, Barnicle resigned from the Boston Globe when there were two columns where he actually took a lot of material from other sources. Um, he resigned. He actually didn't suffer much because he was such a popular fixture. He joined he he joined the New York Daily News, and then went on to work for MSNBC. And he's a prominent individual in terms of the MSNBC setup, where he does breaking news and covers presidential elections, and despite essentially being found guilty of plagiarism and losing his job, has risen to even the higher echelon of journalism. Another important story occurred with Stephen Glass. A movie has been made out of his story. In 1998, it was revealed that many of his published articles were fabrications. And over a 3-year period, as a young rising star, he invented quotations, sources, events in articles that he wrote for the New Republic and for other magazines as well. And he simply made up the stuff. He focused on ethnic slurs and stories, but also one of his main targets was conservative political groups. Jason Blair is a very famous story of the New York Times, essentially promoting a young reporter, and he couldn't stand the pressure, and so he again made stuff up. It turned out that there were, I believe, more than 20 articles that he had written where there was significant fabrication and plagiarism. He left the New York Times. He was fired from the New York Times in 2003. And along with that, the 2 top editors of the newspaper were also fired as a result of promoting Blair throughout the system. A huge black eye for the New York Times. Dan Rather in 60 Minutes, a very famous story where CBS aired a story that claimed that George Bush had shirked military service during Vietnam. And the kind of key component of the investigation were documents from Bush's commander for the Texas National Guard. And during the segment, anchor Dan Rather said that the documents had been authenticated by experts, but ultimately the documents turned out to be false. It's kind of interesting because this was discovered by a blogger, Little Green Footballs, who had actually looked at the font type of the documents and determined that these documents, which were supposedly from the 1970s, had fonts that did not exist until much later. And as a result of the falsification of the story, Rather, who was prominent as the anchor of the CBS Evening News, resigned from his job and later from the network. A huge fall from grace. Another huge fall from grace involved Brian Williams in 2015, where he apologized for stories that he told about his experience during the Iraq War. He claimed that a military helicopter he was traveling in had been forced down after being hit by a rocket-propelled grenade. That story was false, and it turned out that Williams had been making up other stories as he went along in his career, and he was suspended without pay and lost his position as anchor of the NBC Evening News. He still works for MSNBC. A number of people called for his firing by NBC, including me, but he still has a prominent position, although not as high as he once had with NBC News. We have talked about the Rolling Stone article on rape on campus at the University of Virginia. That's another one of these scandals, but since we had already touched on it, I didn't want to go through that. That one was slightly different in that there wasn't a lot of fabrication there. That was confirmation bias, where there was the journalist spent too much time believing a source, and it turned out that the source had made up her story. So there have been a number of examples of fake news, some of which have caused great credibility problems for the journalists and for journalism in particular. So I just wanted to take you through some of those, and Thanks so much, and we'll see you online.